Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine. And in today's podcast, what we're going to be talking about is the patriarchy. But we're going to talk about how the patriarchy hurts men. There's all kinds of conversations that are happening around, thank God, about the patriarchy and how garbage it is in general. But today, we're going to do a closer look at what is a patriarchy. Do we actually live in one? Yes. And what is it doing? How does it perpetuate itself? And what harm does it cause? Now, there are a million people, largely women, who are talking about the effects of patriarchy on women, as it should be. So I'm going to talk about patriarchy and its effects on men, because turns out, if you really look at it, the patriarchy hurts more men than it helps. It helps very, very few men. And the men that it does help, it also hurts. It's a cost-benefit analysis. And unless you're born quite wealthy, then chances are the patriarchy has done more damage to you and your life than it has helped. So we're going to look at all the ways that it can do that. We're going to look at our careers. We're going to look at our everyday life, and we're going to look at our relationships, and we're going to look at how these things perpetuate in a way that harms men. Gay men, straight men, bi men, they men, all of them. So let's get into it. Okay, so what exactly is a patriarchy? A patriarchy is the predominance of men in positions of power and influence in society, with cultural values and norms being seen as favoring men. And we know that we live in a patriarchy, so I'm not going to spend much time on the definition of it. But the fact that we have men in charge at the head of most businesses and that sort of thing, and women also in places of importance, but places that are not as valued. That is the evidence of a patriarchy. The fact that men are the heads of household, or were considered to be heads of household at one point in time, and the women then play second fiddle. Again, a patriarchal hierarchy. And that's something that we kind of need to understand, is that anything that is patriarchal is hierarchical. And that's going to be a theme that we return to a lot. Remember that anything patriarchal is going to be also hierarchical, because it turns out that the patriarchy, if you ask me, is mostly about maintaining power for the few people who have power. And frankly, it just turns out that old rich white men are the ones who have power, and all they're trying to do is help themselves maintain power. They're not trying to help other men. They're just trying to maintain power, and we do that through maintaining control. And there's so many ways that we keep men down in our modern society, while somehow still granting benefits and boons to men. It's very strange. So you guys may remember, I was going to say a few years, but now it's been a few decades back, there was a incredibly influential book called Women Are From Mars and Men Are From Venus. And I feel like that just made things worse, because essentially what they were arguing in the book, to some degree, is that men are hardwired to solve problems in a way, and women are more wired to talk about those problems. And I'm just going to leave that alone because, like, we do know scientifically for sure there are gender differences between interests. Like, that the main difference between men and women, other than like what you have between your legs and how large your areolas are, is the interest. And we find that typically men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And we really got this data because we took the time to look at Norway and Scandinavian countries that have legislated equal access. In a way, some might argue equal outcome, but they've legislated equal access to, like, having 40% of their members be like parliament members or whatever be women, that sort of thing. And when they have done this and purposefully shaped their society in a way that it no longer represses its women, what is interesting about it is that the women started being less manly. If that makes any sense. The women started pursuing careers that were less men-dominated. Now that they have the option and the availability, if they wanted to, they could pursue and possibly attain the jobs and positions that they want in any given field. Women have been choosing in Scandinavia, since things have kind of evened out on a social gender scale, they've been choosing more people-based careers. And so there are some biological differences that we know of in temperament and whatnot. But to say that women are from Mars and men are from Venus, it was cute. But now, looking back, like, that's a little sus. That's, I really, the fundamental thing is that women are from Earth and men are from Earth, and we have to figure out how to get along. And pretending we come from different planets is not a great way to do that. That's why we're having this podcast. We need to teach men how to be good men, and we have no idea how to do that. And unfortunately, most of the conversation that's happening is, like, I feel like men are just trying to be good and stay out of the way of women who are trying to reclaim their power. And that's wonderful. But we are losing ourselves completely and utterly through this process. And part of this is because of this first reason I want to talk about, that the first way that the patriarchy really hurts men. And that is masculinity, according to the patriarchy, is singular. Right? We don't talk about masculinities, do we? We don't talk about the many manifestations of the masculine. That's not a fucking thing. It's masculinity. It is singular. It is singular. If you are a man, you need to be masculine. And that is treated as a singular concept, not plural, which means we are prescribed one way to be. In this whole magical, beautiful, diverse world, men are assigned one way to be, and it is masculine. And there's so many issues. Shepherd Bliss is the person who coined the term toxic masculinity. And, like, out of toxic masculinity, you get like this thing of, like, only men have to initiate. We have to initiate everything. We have to initiate problem solving. We have to initiate interventions. We have to initiate sex. We have to initiate conversations. We have to initiate all the things. And if we don't do that, we're not masculine in its singular expression, which emasculates us. And if we're not masculine, we're not anything, because you're a man. And you're a man, and if you're a white man, the world is given to you, right? Like, the world is just given to white men on a silver platter. And if that gets taken away from you through emasculation, because you didn't meet that definition of this singular form of expression of masculinity, you're screwed. Masculinity also means that, like, this toxic masculinity also means you're never a victim, under any circumstances. You're never a victim. You've got to become a man. You got to be a man, no matter what, whatever that means. And that's different for everybody in every family somehow. But somehow it all kind of also still means the same thing. It's very confusing. It's very confusing to be raised as a man in the United States. I'm not saying that there are other things that you could be born as that wouldn't be worse. Those are facts. But it's very confusing. And if we want to change the social structures that exist, it's men who are in charge, and there are a couple of ways we're going to talk about in a little bit that we are perpetuating this thing, and we will continue to, no matter what women do, no matter how much femininity and feminism makes its rise and claims the power that it deserves, we will remain fucked until we deal with how fucked our men are. And here's reason number 2. Men are fucked because of toxic masculinity, because of the patriarchy. Because the patriarchy pushes toxic masculinity. So I guess that should be number 1. The reason men are hurt by the patriarchy is because the patriarchy constantly pushes toxic masculinity as the only form of masculinity. That's the masculinity as singular and not plural. There is only one form of it, and that is what is pushed by the patriarchy. And I get it. I've talked a little bit about this kind of quasi-narcissism, and we're going to talk more and a little bit about that. But the next reason is because men have an emotional range of 2. What do I mean by that? I mean 1, silence, 2, anger. The end. Emotional range of 2. These are the 2 emotions that men are allowed to express and not be emasculated. And remember, anytime that you're emasculated, it's not like somebody teased me. That's not what happens to men when men are emasculated. I need people to hear this. When men are emasculated, it rips your soul out because your entire identity as a man is wrapped up because of the way, not because of who you are, but because of where you were raised and the culture you're raised in. Our entire identity, often, especially as especially as a cis straight man, your entire identity has to be wrapped up in being masculine, or you're not going to find a mate. You're not going to find a partner. You're not going to find anybody because that is what the world wants from straight men. And that hasn't changed. I see some of that changing through feminism. But most of what I see feminism affecting is women's own concept about themselves, which, yeah, that's where we start. Perfect. But it's not addressing men's issues yet. And that's our job, to address the men's issues. And that's what we're doing here. And one of the biggest ones is that through the patriarchy, the only acceptable emotional state for men to have is either anger or to be in silence. And what that means for women is it means that women have to be the emotional shock absorbers. Right? And this will be the case. Women will have to be the emotional shock absorbers. And because women are more biologically predispositioned to be concerned about people and family and group and community and togetherness, it will continue to go that way. Women will continue to be the shock absorbers because men will either be in silence and aka inactivity, not doing anything, completely shut down, or they're really active and they're using that anger. Right? We're either angry or silent. Those are the only 2. And if those are your only options as a man, every single other thing that needs to be done that can't be done through aggression or inaction is then left up to the women. And this brings me to point number 3, accountability-free relationships, especially in heterosexual couples. It sounds like a good thing for the men, right? It kind of sounds like a good thing that we have these accountability-free relationships where we can just kind of do and say whatever we want, and all of the pieces are picked up for us. But then we wind up being resented by the people who are picking up after us. We wind up being resented by our partners. Through these accountability-free relationships that many cis hetero men have, they are perpetuating the patriarchy completely blindly, because you're forcing women to do the emotional labor, which I love that term because it is very much a labor. It is very much an effort. It is a working. It is a physiological drain to be the ones to focus on the relationship. And men are not allowed to do that, because it does not fit in this toxic masculinity thing. There's just the never a victim, there's be a man, there's violence is acceptable and lauded in many cases, depending on the situation. There's suppressed emotions. We're expected to initiate, and then there's emasculation. And that's kind of like, these are the big kind of branches and results of toxic masculinity. Although it seems like kind of cool on the surface, we see that having these accountability-free relationships basically makes it to where men are big old babies. And we see this in the way men get sick, right? This is something I really want to harp on. So there's the one thing you're not allowed to be as a man is what? Weak. Right? Weakness and vulnerability. What is that, though? What is weakness? What is vulnerability? There's a lot of things that could show weakness. There's a lot of things that could show vulnerability. But what exactly is it? It's kind of a hard concept to define or describe. But when you really think about it, what I realized is what weakness and vulnerability is, when you take it in its most abstract form, the way that we talk about it and use it colloquially in reference to men, is limitations. Men are not allowed to have limitations. They're not allowed to have limits. Not really allowed to say no. Women are not allowed to say no in a very different way. But we're not allowed to have any kind of limit to our abilities, to our capabilities. And you wonder why a male-dominated society, our male-dominated society is so narcissistic and psychotic. Of course it is. Our entire society fosters this concept of blind confidence, for one, in men, because we're not allowed to be anything but that. You're either in that blind confidence, or you're anger, or you're in anger, or you're in silence. For like another major reason that men are hurt by the patriarchy is through this straitjacket of not being weak, through this straitjacket that men experience of invulnerability. Essentially, if you are not weak, if you are not vulnerable, you are therefore invulnerable. There was only one person that we knew of that was invulnerable, and that was Superman. He was made up. We're expected to be invulnerable. So when we get sick, get an illness, oh my God. Any women who are married or have a spouse or whatever that has been sick, you know what I'm talking about. Men are giant babies when we're sick. I'm included in that. We are giant, big old babies. And I really think that the reason that this happens is because, one of two things happens. We either become big old babies, or when we get sick, suddenly we're mean to everybody, and we're meaner, especially to our spouse. And they both come from the same place. They're two different adaptations to this, I cannot be sick. I cannot be vulnerable, because that's what sick means. It means that I was vulnerable and now I'm losing, right? So now it's all right, well, now here the cat's out of the bag. I was vulnerable. I lost the fight. Now I'm sick. And it is the one moment in time that men are allowed to be sad and weak and whiny, and we get it all out all at once. And of course, we don't actually get it all out, but we try to get it all out all at once. And I think that's why we're big old babies when we're sick, is because it's the only time that we're allowed to be. It's the only time that we are allowed to express anything other than that anger and that silence, that emotional range of two. Like this last one is isolation from other men, because everything gets worse in isolation. Absolutely everything. Loneliness kills. Loneliness has been equated to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. There's 20 cigarettes in a pack. That's most of a pack. Most of a pack, 4/5 of a pack. That's a lot of health that we're losing through isolation. And men are the most isolated group on the planet. And we're isolating ourselves more every day because we don't walk to the grocery store or to the city market. We drive. We're isolated the entire time we drive there. We work with people who barely make ends meet, no matter who you are or where you're at. Nobody makes enough money for what they do. So everybody's stressed out. So nobody really likes being around anybody else because they're all stressed out. And if the only things that you're allowed to be are angry and silent, what are you going to do? What kind of relationship is that? It's not one. And that's why men don't really have relationships with other men. And it's terrible. It's terrible. That's something that I do appreciate about the veteran community, especially the older veteran community, is they have figured out that it's really important to be around other people, especially for vets, to be around other vets who have had similar experiences. But it's really, really healing to be around other people and to not be isolated. But isolation is one way that the patriarchy is destroying men every single day. There's a book that I just heard about that I'm very excited to read that is called, I don't want to talk about it, Overcoming the Secrecy of Male Depression. And there were some quotes that I read from this that were really good. So I'm excited to check this book out, because the secrecy of male depression is such a great subtitle, because that is what drives male depression, is the secrecy. We have to be secret about our entire emotional experience. We're expected to keep that on the inside. Repressed emotions is a fundamental staple of being a man in a patriarchal society. You have to have these repressed emotions. You're supposed to be able to bottle them up and burn them if you can, but not all of us can. And the isolation that we get from other men is terrible. And this thing of repressing one's emotions becomes that much worse when you talk about gay men, especially young gay people. When you talk about young gay people, young gay people, we know through science now has figured out that gay people, go figure, are higher on the emotional intelligence stuff, right? We score higher on emotional intelligence. And we also have found correlations between mothers' stress in the third trimester and being gay. Almost that there is an epigenetic influence on okay, this is really stressful. Mama's gonna need help. She's not gonna need more grandbabies. She's gonna need more help. And this is also added, the theory is given more weight by the validity of it's for every male child that you have in a row, you get 33% more chance with each birth to have a gay son. So there's a few things that point to this kind of evolutionary behavior, but when you take people who are extremely emotionally adept, we have high emotional intelligence, and then you tell those children that they must repress that because they are male-bodied. I think that's probably why 29% of gay teens have attempted suicide at some point in their life. 30%, 1 out of 3 gay men in their teens have attempted suicide. And I think it's very much related to this. It's very much related to, even as much as it it could be related to bullying and like all of that. I think like those outright injustices are easier to deal with, because there's more of a chance that somebody is going to be there to be like, no, that's fucked up. And when that happens, when there is somebody there to say that, you can go through hell and not leave traumatized. You'll leave changed and angry maybe, but not traumatized. Because trauma is what happens in the absence of an empathetic witness. But there is no empathetic witness to repressed emotions. Ever. I'm going to say that again for you. There is no empathetic witness for repressed emotions. So if any of your trauma in your life has caused you, any experience in your life has caused you to have a tendency to default towards repression, like keeping your shit to yourself, just know that you will never heal that way. Because trauma is what happens in the absence of an empathetic witness. And whatever you repress inside yourself, you have already deemed to be unworthy, or you wouldn't repress it, and therefore you are not empathetic to your own plight. You will never, ever heal through repressed emotions. And that is what the patriarchy wants of men. The patriarchy, the way that it is now, it doesn't want men in power. It wants toxic men in power, because toxic masculinity is very similar to sociopathy. And that is how capitalism runs. All corporations meet all of the markers for sociology, and many of them for psychopathy, or for sociology, for psychopathy and sociopathy. They meet the marks, and that is what our entire system is predicated on. Like, the patriarchy wants to maintain power. It doesn't want men to maintain power. The patriarchy needs to maintain power as it is. And those people perpetuating it are toxic. And they are creating more toxic men to run the toxic patriarchy. So if we don't deal with what the patriarchy does to men, it's only going to take one. It only ever takes one injured, toxic person to make it to the top and make all those decisions. And suddenly we have a whole nother generation, maybe even a whole nother half century of one person being in charge who is toxic, making toxic decisions for everybody else. Which brings me to my last point, which is about Nelson Mandela. If you don't know him, Google him. He was amazing. But he changed apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa forever. And he did it with a 2-part principle. And he created this commission based on these two parts. And that commission was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the reason I bring this up now is because he said no section of our society has escaped the abuses of apartheid. And so when Nelson Mandela was put in charge, what he wanted and what he did was he made it to where everyone who was a victim of the apartheid was given reconciliation. And everyone who was an abuser in the apartheid was given forgiveness. They all had amnesty. Not because the apartheid was terrible, it wasn't terrible, but because they were people caught in a system that perpetuated itself. in the exact same way that our patriarchy is a system that perpetuates itself. And the people participating, men and women and thems, all of which, like all of us, are just chess pieces on a board. And that game is being played whether we like it or not. And I don't want to see men be vilified just for being a man. I don't want to see masculinity vilified, because it's not a singular word. It's plural. Masculinities are ways that we express the divine masculine nature in us, in all of us, in men and women and thems. So I bring up Nelson Mandela to say we really have to focus on forgiveness and on honesty and truth. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We must reconcile the problems that have been created. And those problems are not just affecting women. They're affecting men too, in massive, massive ways. The last thing that I wanted to bring up, I've got a quote from Marion Woodman here, who is a Jungian philosopher, who says patriarchy has done as profound damage to men as it has to women. She looks like a cool lady. One of the other problems that we have with boys is we don't raise them in the same way that we like raise girls. We don't cultivate boys the way that we cultivate girls. Growing up female in the U.S., you have some rituals that mark your progression towards being a woman. Like when women reach their periods, and not always, but there ought to be, and there often is, more so than there is for boys, there's a conversation about it. There's mom takes you to go buy pads and to go get tampons and birth control and all of that sort of thing. And when girls go and get bras, same thing. These are all little markers that your family walks you through, your mothers typically walk you through on your way to becoming a man. And it doesn't really happen at all for boys. There is no, when pubic hair shows up, we don't really talk about it. When erections happen, nope. Nobody's talking about it. There's nobody to explain anything. We don't talk about wet dreams. There is shaving. That's something that we do. There are TV commercials and that sort of thing. So shaving is kind of there. But we don't really know what it's like to be a male. And outside of, you grow facial and crotch hair, we don't get much. So I bring that up to say, if we had more rituals in our culture to show men what it is to be a man, besides just shaving and trying to pull tail on prom night or whatever, if we actually took the time, instead of being like, men have had all the power and now it's time for women, do that too. But if we actually took the time to train men in the masculinities and to increase their emotional range of 2 to maybe 5, I think that could be really beneficial. I think that would build more accountability in our relationships, which would build more equanimity in our relationships. And I'm talking about our personal and romantic relationships. And when that happens, the home patriarchal hierarchy of the man on top and then the woman and then the children, that shifts. And when the base unit shifts, everything on top has to shift eventually. It takes time and it's slow. But if we start there, we can start in the house. And we get these basic shifts in the way that we organize our family systems. And the only way that we can do that is by dealing with the repression of men. Like, there's no way around it. There's the whole caretaking aspect and the accountability-free relationship aspect, and all of that stems from the forced repression of all emotions in men. What do you expect men to do or act or behave like when all of their emotions are repressed? When men who have spent their entire lives repressing their emotions wind up in charge of mega corporations, what do you think they're going to do with other people's emotions and concerns? Dismissed. If they can't feel their own, they don't give a fuck about yours. So we've covered a few things as to why men struggle under the patriarchy, why men are downright abused in the patriarchy. But I think the number one biggest problem that men have because of the patriarchy is the expectation of repressed emotions. Because when you repress your emotions, you're not in charge of yourself. Our emotions, can almost always predict our behavior. Our emotional state almost always predict our behaviors. And if we don't know what we're feeling because we have repressed them, we're not in charge of ourselves. We don't get to act in line with who we are. We don't know who we are. So that's my number one complaint. We've got to recognize that men are also hurt by the patriarchy. I genuinely believe as much as women. And I believe that a lot of the damage that the patriarchy has done to women is directly due to the damage that patriarchy has done to men. And I hope that makes sense. The patriarchy doesn't want men in charge. The patriarchy wants broken, toxic people in charge. Doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. You need to be broken and toxic. Look at our politics. Even the women. Broken, toxic people. And the reason that they're broken is because they are separated from themselves. That's the break. That's the wound. The separation of one part of oneself from another. And that's who runs things, unfortunately. If we want to change that, we've got to recognize that the patriarchy destroys men. Fundamentally. Wholeheartedly. The patriarchy is not pro-man, it's pro-toxicity. And that's all I've got to say. That's all I've got to say today. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for listening. I hope that this was insightful for you. I hope it made you think a little bit. We need to do better for our women, but we also need to do better for our men. And when we do better for our men, we will make the whole world a better place immediately, including for our women. So thank you for your time. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a like, leave us a review. I greatly appreciate that. Share it with some friends. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.